Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who join us from European time zones. A very warm welcome to our 5th edition of the Declares and Share series. We have a great session planned for you today with speakers from WWF and the Forum for the Future. This session will be moderated by Benjamin Towell, who some of you may know from our earlier sessions. Benjamin is a multidisciplinary award-winning advocate and policymaker, architect, chartered surveyor, and chartered environmentalist. A few quick words on the declaration. Construction Declares is an online declaration uniting all strands of the built environment. It started about 2 years ago in the UK and has now over 6,000 signatories in various disciplines across the globe. Early January last year, we embarked on the Singapore chapter into the climate declaration, both for the Singapore architects and the Singapore structural engineers. In June, we've set up the Singapore and Global Environmental Consultants Declaration. And just recently, the Singapore landscape architects joined the declaration as well. And as of last week, the Global Interior Designers Declaration, so the Interior Designers Declaration has also been set up, so we're hoping for interested parties in Singapore to come together for the Singapore chapters of the interior designers as well. And with that and without further ado, welcome again to everyone, and over to you, Benjamin.
Thanks very much. Good to be here again in the hot seat, and really looking forward to a wonderful session today, which is going to help provide slightly different perspectives on climate change, biodiversity, and the issues that we face, more from a policy and a strategic kind of level, which I think is going to be really valuable for us in the built environment, and how our work really does impact the wider spheres of influence and how they in turn impact our work as well. So the format will be the speakers. We have 2 wonderful speakers who will share their insights independently, and then after that we'll have a nice discussion. Please enter in your questions in the Q&A chat box. I will try and answer as many as possible, or I won't. I shall put them to our distinguished speakers to answer. We'll have a very informal dialogue based on those questions, and of course some of the key themes that come from their presentations. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sandeep from the World Wildlife Fund. He's a senior advisor on global climate policy, and has a lot of experience on dealing with climate change issues and things like that, including science-based targets. So I think this is going to be really wonderful, and he's going to look at the built environment and climate change from that kind of broader policy perspective. Over to you, Sandeep. I'll give you 10 minutes. You'll see my face pop up when it's about time to wrap up. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you, Ben. And let me share my screen. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Ben. And first of all, thank you so much for Singapore Construction Declares for giving me this opportunity to say a few words on climate change and built environment. As Ben mentioned during the introduction, my expertise is mostly from the policy perspective. So I will dealing in today's presentation. I will be really talking about the global perspective about the built environment and its relation to the climate change, and my other colleague will narrow down at the local or the Singapore related focus. So without any further ado, let me go through my presentation. This is the slide that I really want to bring attention to all of you that I took from the Professor Haikon, who had really done an average, I would say, annual temperaturized annual temperature scenario in the Singapore from early 1900s to 2018. And the blue side, wherever you see in the blue side, is more about the lesser temperature. And as you go toward the right hand side, which is more on the red zone, so which shows that the temperature is increasing over the century. And this is not the case of Singapore only, it's the case of the all country in the world. So the temperature is really increasing as we go along. And let me highlight a little bit on the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, I mean, why I bought the Paris Agreement is that because to deal with the climate change, the Paris Agreement, which you all may be aware of, that was adopted in 2015, and the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, I would say, is the key component and of the whole climate debate. And the Article 2, especially the para A, really talks about holding to increase the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and to pursue effort to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degree above pre-industrial level. And that's a really key, and the temperature target of 1.5, limiting 1.5 temperature target is really a key one. And in today's world, we are already around 1.1 and 1.2 degree above pre-industrial level. So we don't have a time of luxury in terms of limiting our temperature target. But apart from that, the Paris Agreement also talks about the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and to make a financial flow that is consistent with the pathway of low greenhouse gas and climate resilience development. So this is the cornerstone of the Paris Agreement, if you want, and from my particular perspective. And why the temperature target of 1.5 versus 2 degrees is really key in this particular slide that I want to really highlight, that what's the impact the world will face in 1.5 degree temperature target versus 2 degree. Just to see example below, in the sea level rise, around 46 million people will be impacted in 2100 at 1.5 degree temperature rise, and around 49 people will be impacted at the 2 degree temperature rise scenario. And that's quite vast difference. And I assume, as you may all know, most of the sea level rise will be faced within the built environment or the city sectors, which are and most of the cities are in low-lying state, like the Singapore, for example. And another built environment things in the water availability. If you look at this particular component, in 1.5 degree temperature rise, around 350 million urban residents will be exposed to serious drought, whereas in 2 degrees, around 410 million urban residents will be exposed to severe drought. And that's quite alarming. So though 0.5 degree is not a big, if you see from a local perspective, but at the global average, that has been devastating impact. And if you look the INDC, the International Determined Contribution that every country has put forward for the Paris Agreement, we are still heading towards 2.7 degree plus world, and we really need to reach to 1.5. And what does 1.5 means? And this is the graph that I took from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this has really coined the term what now everybody's talking about, net zero. So what the IPCC talk about is to reach 1.5 degree by 2100, the carbon dioxide needs to be reduced at least 40 to 50% by 2030 from the baseline of 2010, and needs to be reached net zero by 2050 by all countries. And this is the place where the net zero comes. And if you look in the Asian country context, is Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand are the country who has really put forward the net zero target by 2050. Singapore has the net zero target, but Singapore net zero target is as soon as viable in the second half of the century. So which that mean anywhere in the year 2051 to 2099. So Singapore, the current long-term emission target is not in the line of what the science is talking about, what is needed to stabilize at 1.5 degree temperature rise. And just to move forward now, where's the problem? The built environment. If you look at the built environment, and I took from the Architects 2030, which talks that building really accounts 40% of the total greenhouse gas emission globally. So when I talk about building, I'm just choosing the building sector. And so the transportation sector also contributes around 23% of the total emission worldwide. So this is the area where we see a big, I would say, big problem, and the built environment is where we really need to address on. And apart from that, as we all know, that by 2050, around 2/3 of the world population will live in the cities or live within the built environment. And just to be assured that the built environment is although source of the greenhouse gas emission, but also is the place where the victim or where the climate impacts will be. So we need to factor that within the context. And just to give very briefly on the Singapore context where we are, the measure of the emission comes from the transport industry and the buildings. And in the Singapore context, we said this is the 100% of emission is coming from built environment, because Singapore being as a city state. But having said that, if you look at the transport and the building sector only, the Singapore emission, 30% of the Singapore emission comes from these two particular components, which are the key component of the built environment sector. So we really need to address this particular, I would say, sector, and also really make the built environment as a part of the solution for the both climate and nature, or climate and biodiversity. And it is up to us whether we want to make our, I would say, the built environment, let's say, high carbon, or we want to make our built environment to low carbon. So in terms of making towards low carbon, we really need to make our built environment low carbon, climate resilient, and also use the power of nature in terms of to address the biodiversity and the climate crisis, like urban nature-based solution initiative. We can use that, or we can also use and develop some of the biodiversity hotspot or the corridor within the urban built environment that's really address the climate as well as the biodiversity challenge. And this is just I would say this is just a documentary that our colleague has really produced, our cities team, which really talks about shall we build our streets for people and nature. And this is just a kind of okay, it just let me say whether this is going or not. But anyhow, in this one, it's trying to show anyhow. So it's more about building our street for peace of people and nature rather than cars and others. And so that's what the slide was really trying to show. And next one, in terms of the solution, to address the built environment, I would say challenges, there are also a couple of solutions. And just to highlight the science-based target initiatives, which is the initiative that has been put forward by WWF in conjunction with CDP, UN Global Compact, or WRI, where the certain sector can really take a science-based target initiative to reduce their individual carbon footprint. And just to give example, in the context of Singapore, the CapitaLand is one of the property developer has really put forward their emission reduction target of scope 1 and scope 2 of 28% emission reduction with a baseline of 2019 by 2030. And in scope 3, they want to reduce the emission from the capital good of 22% per square meter by 2030 from 2019 level. And there are some kind of tools that already exist where some of the key players within the built environment can really go into play. And you can see much more on the science-based targeting later on. And lastly, before concluding my presentation, I just also want to highlight the linkages between the built environment and reaching the net zero target by 2050 with the upcoming the Paris the COP26, where the COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow, is one of the key outcomes is to address the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which main objective is to establish a carbon mechanism that will allow the countries or the many industry players to reach net zero target by 2050 through buying the carbon offset from other places. So that mechanism is yet to be defined. So in conclusion, I would say the built environment is one of the cause of the climate change problem, and the climate change impacts has been already seen in the built environment and likely to increase as the temperature rises up, and that needs to be checked. But built environment can be a part of the solution, and there are already some of the existing tools like the science-based target and the One Planet City Challenge and others, which will really allow the built environment and to be low carbon development pathway. So let me stop there by just highlighting this One Planet City Challenge that WW has put forward. We really try to address the challenges of the cities or the built environment and how to make our cities or the built environment low carbon climate resilience development. So let me stop there, Ben, and happy to take questions later on. Over.
Okay, thanks very much, Sandeep. That's really, really lovely. I got from that, quite a bit on the context, which is always good to reaffirm, which gives, the need for some of those key areas that we do need to work on, decarbonisation. And again, it was really good to hear, looking at nature and nature-based solutions as well, which I'll probably ask some questions on in a bit. And something else that came out was, we're hearing more and more corporate declarations going towards zero carbon, net zero. They talk about scope 1, 2, and some even go as far as scope 3. So it's interesting that you did highlight, some of those targets using, say, for example, the science-based targets for that kind of corporate decision making. Again, I think I'm going to probably probe you on where you see those going in due course as well. But before I do, and before you end up being grilled by me and our audience, I'd like to introduce Madhu, who is a senior sustainability strategist at Forum for the Future, with many years coaching businesses and organizations to adapt to long-term sustainability challenges. So she's going to give us a wonderful presentation on exploring the dynamic themes in sustainability and their implications for businesses in the environmental sector. So Madhu, same for you, 10 minutes, and I'll pop up when you need to start to summarize. Okay.
Thanks, Ben, and welcome everyone. Thanks, Sandeep. I think Sandeep did a great job in kicking us off with looking at the global context, the scale of the challenge, as well as looking at the changing regulatory context. My focus, I would do two things in this presentation, largely look at what are some of the spaces where my organization, Forum for the Future, is seeing lots of dynamism and sustainability and what that means for the business context, and then zoom in on specific areas that my team in Singapore is looking at within the Singaporean context of specific complex challenges that require systems thinking in how we solve these kinds of intractable challenges. So a little bit about Forum for the Future. We're a non-profit organization that has been based in Singapore for the last about 8 years. And our focus is in really catalyzing change in critical global challenges and sustainability, both social and environmental. And two of the tools that we use is systems thinking and futures, primarily as a way to extend our horizons, think more deeper about the complexity of the challenges and how interconnected issues are, and a way of unpicking that in our work rather than coming up with one part or narrow solutions to these really complex challenges. And one of the ways in which we use futures was a report that was released, I think in November 2019, looking at what we think the decade ahead will look like. And it speaks to a lot of the challenges that Sandeep has raised. But I'll go into some of these dynamic areas in a very top line level, and we have 5 of them. So the first one that we've been looking at is just biosphere breakdown and the scale of that challenge. And I think what Sandeep spoke about earlier was very much in our perspective of that, the current climate leadership, even with the best of targets, are not bringing us towards a 1.5 degree world. And there are critical tipping points in terms of our biosphere that are being reached. And a question around, with the kind of different kind of feedback loops around biodiversity loss, around our food systems that are being affected, as well as our energy systems that are under pressure. What does that look like? So that's one sort of key area that we look at. And then we see that that is interconnected with the kind of economic crisis that the world is facing, particularly in light of the pandemic, but was pre-existing even before that in terms of the economic shrinkages that we see around in the world. And very important to the built environment sector, because that is often with lots of these building back better plans, the built environment is quite a big part of that. So it's really interesting to see what does that mean in terms of we have an economic crisis with growth needs and at the same time a massive scale of environmental issues and challenges. And at the same time, we're facing issues around governance and technology, and that when we come up with our solutions that are largely technological, they have issues around governance, around traceability and transparency, the levels of surveillance capitalism within that, and what that means in terms of our political systems and our ability to participate in change. And one of the things that has risen up quite up to the fore is just issues and inequality that have become really prominent in the world, and that climate change and climate action can't just focus on the environmental issues, but also look at how the social world of it is affected. And with the kind of rise of activism in the form of Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion, we know that it's not just about green transitions, but also just transitions and what that begins to look like, and all the confluence of trends within that. And finally, something that we're seeing, and quite a lot of that are in specific targets in the corporate sector around regenerative targets. But what we are seeing is that there are new business models, new ownership models, and also ways of thinking that are moving past just net zero targets, but looking at how do we not just build back better, but in terms of having kind of bringing back nature, and bringing back ways of thinking that regenerates and not linear systems, but circular systems. So these are sort of dynamic areas that we're seeing that are all interacting with each other and shaping what this world would look like. And we're seeing a lot of that in Asia broadly. Some of the things I've chosen to highlight is just temperatures rising significantly and the amount of heat that the region is literally facing. And at the same time, what that means for the lived experience in the built environment being, as mentioned, both a part of that and also being part of the solution. And also in terms of our emissions and carbon dioxide, that's rising a lot faster in this region than in other parts of the world, just by how developmental the region is. And also the kind of economic impacts of these changes are going to be significant, and that is going to be faced by the people. And thinking in terms of justice and inequality, we're seeing that it is the poorest communities that contribute least to carbon emissions, but suffer the most in terms of economic losses, as well as health and social impacts. So we're seeing this. This is not some abstract thing, but this is something that's a part of our lived experience already, and is only going to get much worse if we don't do something about it in the years that we are in. And where does COVID and the pandemic fit in all of this is that these are systemic issues, they interplay with one another. And what the pandemic has done is it has caused a level of disruption that has opened up these interconnections in a way that we know the complexity of supply chains, and disruptions mean that these complexities come to the fore, and it's a lot harder to make things simpler, and the complexity means that we need to work with it in order to look at solutions rather than to come up with simple technological solutions alone. And this particular moment that we are standing in, these next 6 to 12 months, 18 months are particularly critical. As Christina Figueres puts it, this is the decisive decade for climate change. This is it. And if we don't do something about it, we will be made. And this affects our children and their children and our future generations ahead. So what we did based on these kinds of complexities that we are seeing through our horizon scanning as Forum for the Future is not just that these things are happening abstract in the world. Change that's happening in the world is caused by, lived by, and then experienced by us as human beings, and how we come together shapes how we create change in the world. And one of the things we've been looking at is just different models, mental models, and ways of seeing the world that shape what kind of world that we'll be living in the next 10 to 15 years. And I'm not going to talk about these, but one of the things that you could do is to look at our Future of Sustainability report that was published. And one of the things that we are doing as Forum for the Future here is to figure out if we want to shift businesses and communities towards a transformed mindset and way of thinking, what does that look like? And we are actually working with different corporate partners on building strategies and ways of thinking that are aligned with that. So there were two issues that I wanted to raise in terms of thinking about it from a Singaporean lens. One of it was actually sand use. In terms of where the built environment sits in these kinds of issues, I'll go back a little, is that a lot of built property and in terms of landscaping, a lot of that is done in quite a permanent way. The life cycle of of an asset tends to be quite long. So whenever we set something that's in motion, that's there for the next 20, 30, or even 40 years. So there is a role in terms of not just if we think through these solutions in systemic ways from the beginning, the asset, the life cycle of that is going to be quite long. And also the fact that we're looking at building back better, there is a role for the built environment to think through these things. So the two areas that I will look at are areas that are often overlooked in built environments. And we in Forum for the Future are looking to see if we built ways of working within these areas, what will that look like? So one area is sand use, and this is something that I've done, I did my research around, and this is my area of expertise, is that sand is often unthought of. It's seen as this, it's seen as a taken for granted that we use it. But it's actually something that's quite critical for our built environment. It's a starter material that goes into various supply chains of the urban environment. It goes into concrete, glass, and even our toothpaste contains silica. So sand is a backbone of our built environment. And the scale of the use is massive. China uses more concrete in 2 years than all of the United States in the entire 20th century. And if you look at the picture that I've added in the graphic, if we're looking at the next 30 years of use of materials, the highest are going to be in non-metallic minerals, and much of that is in sand. So the demand is going high, supply is going low, and the environmental impacts of that are quite high, particularly in this region. In Singapore, why this is really interesting for Singapore is we are the world's biggest importer of sand for land reclamation as well as construction. And we have environmental impacts and social impacts that are quite spectacular. So sand that's taken from other parts of Southeast Asia is transported into Singapore, and it causes different kinds of impacts in terms of new vulnerabilities to climate change, pollution from dredging, and also issues in terms of waterways being affected based on flooding and as well as droughts in different parts of rivers and water systems that the sand is dredged from, as well as a loss of coastal habitats and livelihoods. And despite all of these kinds of impacts, a lot of our solution spaces in the built environment tend to be around reducing sand use rather than thinking about what does restorative solution and what does justice in the system look like, particularly not just in terms of current use, but also in terms of our future use and the scale of that and the impact of what that is going to look like. So that is one issue that we've been keeping active in our thinking. The second that we've been thinking about quite a lot is looking at just greening as a whole and renaturalizing systems. So Singapore for the longest time has been a garden city. And in the last few years, there's been a kind of a shift towards going from manicured spaces towards wilderness and more natural spaces. And a lot of that is within the city in nature and green plan initiatives that the government has set. A lot of this is going to be critical in some of these issues that we've raised around climate issues like urban island heat effect, as well as our well-being, as well as issues of mental health and being able to appreciate. One of the things that happened in COVID is that more people started noticing our butterflies and our wild greens in Singapore because they were not being cut until the cross-cutting happened. But despite these kinds of kind of requirements in for built environments, kind of regulatory changes in Singapore, what we do see is that there is continued human-wildlife conflict, and there's a lot of, even with support for less manicured landscaping, there is conflict, and this is something that means that people who are designing these spaces to last need to think about how the community comes in and uses these spaces, not just as a buyer of that space and user, but actually in potentially designing that space together and looking at what does it mean for us to be in community with a space. So one of the things that comes up here is just what are the trade-offs that comes up when we are looking at the development needs of the country, as well as our need to green the space, and how can we come together to put the needs of community first in design, as well as in landscaping. So these are some of the issues that we've been thinking about in the context of the broader issue of where sustainability is moving in our perspective, and what we think the role of built environment might look like. So those are broadly where I was going to go. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. Wonderful presentation there. So a few of my initial key takeaways from that is, of course, once again, that call for an urgency of action rather than just conjecture and discussion. So looking at all those spheres of influence which we actually have, you know, whether it be in our profession and our responsibilities in that to our sector. And also one of the things that struck me also was, you know, smart is the new green, as it seems to be at the moment, but rather than jumping straight to those smart solutions, looking at the myriad of solutions to those very complex problems, which can't all be tackled by a sensor or by crunching data for data's sake. That's not to devalue useful data and useful action on that useful data. So now we've come to the segment where I'll ask some questions. There's a question and answer box kind of there on your screen. So please do type away, and I will keep tabs on it as I go. I'll try not to distract me too much. But in the meantime, I'll kick off with a few questions, if that's okay. So I'm going to start where Sandeep entered, which was on temperature, and also alluded to that climate breakdown, Madhu, in your presentation. So 6 of the world's top 10 countries impacted by climate change are actually in Southeast Asia. And when we talk about the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions, currently that's looking at about a 4-degree world by 2100. Interestingly, places like Singapore, that's actually going to be more like +8 degrees, which is quite terrifying, actually. And that would lead to a 50% reduction in food yield in this area alone. So how can we, relating to the built environment, because this is a mega topic, how can we kind of within that built environment sphere start to stimulate really collective action where it's needed based on some of these scenarios? I'll start with Sandeep on that one, if I may.
Thank you, Ben. I think you really highlighted the crux of the problem, and you are really right. And even if you look what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, mentioned that in the Asia or in the Asia context, one of the impacted region will be Southeast Asia because of the low-lying cities, and that has been really well captured. Well, but though we know the problem, the solution that the built environment can do is looking into the different sectors of the built environment and how that can be, I would say, transformed into the low carbon trajectory or low carbon pathway. Just to give example, the transport sector, how we can greenize, how we can make our transport sector much more green is one of the key components. Just to give example, in the context of Singapore, the transport sector contributes around 17% of the Singapore emission. And mostly related to the use of fossil fuel. Can the transportation sector be much more electrified through renewable energy sources? So that's one component part that we really need to look into the building sector. So the building sector is not only about the energy use, it's also about the material use for the construction of the building. And can that be reduced in a way that emits less carbon? Well, Modi mentioned a little bit about the sand issue, which is also which also contributes to the greenhouse gas emission. So can our building sectors, can our land use be, I would not say positive carbon, but I would say, can they be as low emitting as much as we can? So that's one thing. And for the, as I mentioned in my presentation on the science-based target initiatives, and the science-based target initiatives is not only about the company being able to get the science-based target that is in line with the Paris Agreement, but also some of the key players, for example, the transportation sector, the aviation players, or even the banking sectors who really provide money for the built environment. They can be also part. They can also take a journey of the science-based target initiatives, where they can be able to, I would say, decarbonize their entire portfolio and put in the path that is in line to the Paris Agreement. There are many, I would say, companies within the built environment. They are already taking that journey. So the bottom line is, there are the tools that will allow to decarbonize your portfolio. It is up to the matter of willingness of individual company or individual sector whether to take that path or not. And lastly, it's not only about the carbon and the climate, the whole biodiversity crisis. Whether we like it or not, we need the biodiversity into the whole overall picture, because the biodiversity provides the basic necessity for the human beings, for living beings. So we need to make a built environment in a way that also encompass not only reducing the carbon footprint, but also how to address the biodiversity, the component within the picture. And lastly, to the urban planner and architecture, in your entire operation, or into your, I would say, urban planning or designing building, try to incorporate as much as, let's say, nature or biodiversity within the planning purpose, as well as make sure those buildings are much more energy efficient. And that's also one of the key players, because energy efficiency is also a low hanging fruit within the bigger picture when we're talking about the climate. So these are few things that came to my mind in terms of your question, Ben, but happy to provide more if needed. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Madhu, I'd quite like to hear your view on how we can stimulate that kind of collective action, you know, to address these issues, building on that.
I loved the sort of very step-by-step analysis that Sandeep brought in. And I think that for me, I would go much further ahead to the start, which is some of the things you highlighted, Benjamin, like just living in an 8-degree world or 8-degree Singapore. I would just like the people in this panel just to sit with that for a second and to think of the scale of that and the experience of that. And I think that a lot of us, the problem with collective action, a lot of that is still lip service or very superficial, because we're not quite grappling with how deep and how challenging some of these issues are going to be. And even just seeing that, like sometimes when I'm presented some of this information, it's just incredibly overwhelming. It just brings up so much grief. I know that a lot of the, particularly youths and young people I know, the ones who were part of coming up with the climate rally in 2019, have hold a lot of anxiety, climate anxiety around what this future will look like. And I think that people who are making day-to-day decisions around climate change, and as well as just industry as we think of it, need to be sitting with some of these realities in a much deeper way, and before we even go into all of these actions, because if we don't have a clear why, we are not going to be very good on our how. I think the next step in terms of global collective action, I think, is really to understand our agency. I have worked in this sector for 7 years, and I work with businesses, often C-suite folks. And the response I often get is, I don't have enough power to make any change. I'm just one business. And that is often the mainstream narrative that I hear in my work, which is really, for anyone who's outside of a business, it's quite something to hear. Is you have a multi-million-dollar business, and how is it that you think you don't have agency? And I think the problem with that is not that they're lying at all. I think what it is that our agency gets lost and our ability to make change gets lost in our day-to-day decision making. We as an organization believe is about extending our time horizons. So for built environments, sometimes decisions are made based on a quarterly basis. But if you're looking at business model changes or deeper issues around retrofitting buildings and kind of redesigning buildings for flexible use so that they're not there for 20 years or 30 years, if we're looking at these kinds of things, that takes a different kind of decision-making calculus to be able to say, actually, I have agency to redesign the system, and these are the people I need to work with. But in order to get there, we need to be thinking like that, and then being able to put those pieces together. And that's why we are advocating for a systems change approach, because without seeing those interconnections, we are solving for individual problems and having incremental solutions for them. And we are not, like, I think what Sandeep, what Ben, you said, and what I've been impressing upon this group is we don't have the time or luxury to do that. Our lives as they stand and the next 20 years, next 10 years, next 5 years are going to be affected much more significantly. And we need to be thinking more deeply to be able to go further on some of these solutions. And I think some of the realities we have been a part of the problem, a big part of this problem, but we can't solve all of that just by coming up with the technologies around it, as I was saying. So some of it is changing our relational dynamics. How do we work with communities in a genuine way that is not just stakeholder engagement, but stakeholder kind of bringing in our agendas and kind of building our solutions together. So I think it's not just about coming up with solutions, but also changing our relationships with nature, with communities, with our I think someone asked about our material use and relationship with our materials as well. And knowing that, like, a lot of us don't even know what's past the second tier of our supply chain. So I think some of these things is awareness, and then moving us on to what is our agency within this awareness.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, I agree, and there's aspects of that which I'm sure will resonate with some of our audience, especially when you look at timeline. A lot of practicing consultants, architects, engineers know that even though we're designing and working on projects which will span multiple decades, if not hundreds of years, the time that we have and the resources that we have, unfortunately, to make those value choices is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and we're not able in many circumstances to give the due care attention that they deserve, given the kind of corporate approach to that. So with that in mind, I'm sure there's quite a bit of sympathy from our audience on that. Before I get on to the multiple good questions that I can see on the Q&A box, which is great, I will address them. There were things which were touched on, which relate to which relate to corporates and decarbonisation and you know how there is that feeling that I'm just one business in an ecosystem. How can I make that change? But on the other hand, you have this massive celebration and backslapping of I'm going to be zero carbon in 2050 or even 2030. So how do you kind of see this corporate move? Is it a real moment in time where we're going to see some progressive movement, or is it another celebrate now, kick the can down the road later? Because who knows, has anyone met their 2010 objectives or their 2015 objectives? So, you know, it's a question of the value of ESG reporting. It's a question of the value of these ESG targets and their time frame for it. How do you feel? I'm personally quite torn. I see them both in a very positive light, and the cynic in me just looks at it going, great, so what are you doing today to do it? Because I'm not seeing that massive momentum change. So Madhu, I'll start with you on that one. Then Sandeep, if we keep the answers relatively condensed, and then I'll be able to touch the Q&A box.
Sure, I think that's a great question, and it's something any sustainability practitioner sits with all the time. One of the reasons why we work with strategy, businesses on strategy, is that we believe that unless it is taken seriously in any business, it's not going to move forward. So we're seeing a lot of decarbonization targets that are often still not particularly ambitious. And even when there is an ambition, we are seeing one of the things where people are kind of moving quite slowly, or we know, oh, they've set it for 2030, we're 10 years down, and they're not going to be able to achieve it. So one of the challenges we are facing right now is that where I'm seeing a lot of hope is where businesses are working in collaboration with others. One good example, I would think, and not in the built environment sector, but in the shipping sector, is that they've come up with a massive decarbonization target as an industry. And what that means is that these companies are not just working alone. The level of importance is given at the very senior level. Often CEOs have come together to set that target. And that means that there is a strong push. That means that it's not just lip service. And that, I mean, there is a lot of turmoil in the industry of how do we get to that target. But I think there is the need for that based on the urgency of that challenge. And also there is the will towards it. So I think those are the two things I tend to look at. The other thing I look at in terms of how seriously something is taken is often in many businesses, sustainability sits under CSR or communications. And that means that the most senior people just don't have any say or don't even consider sustainability as a massive challenge. Whereas in certain businesses, it sits with risk, or it sits with strategy in the organization. So that means that the level of seriousness it's taken at is completely different. So I think you're right, there are challenges, but in my point of view, a lot of the solutions sit with how seriously is it taken, and there's a governance structure within businesses and between businesses and communities in collaborations. Is that set in a way that enables ambition and a kind of fleet of foot working towards that ambition?
Sandeep, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. I can relate to your, I would say, your hesitation on that part. And I would say I'm cautiously optimistic in terms of the company taking their target. And why I say that is that because there is no, I would say, compliance regime within the framework if the company is not meeting their net zero target by certain years. So that's a drawback. But having said that, if you recall why the Copenhagen was failed in 2009 and why the Paris Agreement was success in 2015, the bigger picture behind that is also the industry players also felt that they really need to address the climate challenges for their own survival in a long-term perspective. So that's also one of the key things we can say, that why the Copenhagen in 2009 failed compared to the Paris Agreement in 2015, because the industry player was the time was not right for the industry sectors in many countries. But if you look about many industry players, not in the urban built environment, but if you look at the automobiles players, most of the automobile company are really going towards electrifying their entire operation. So going away from the fossil fuel driven and towards the I would say towards the electric cars and others. So that's also one positive things what we can see. But for me, the net zero is a kind of a loophole for any company to take, unless and until they say they want to be a zero carbon. Because for net zero, if the company has a money or resources, they can definitely offset their carbon emission, which is in a way that builds for other projects to be much more, I would say, the climate friendly project can be further built. So if you look at the holistic things, many companies coming and setting up this target, it is a good movement. And I have also talked with some of company in the Singapore when discussing about the science-based target initiatives. they told me that they are not ready because they don't understand the baseline. And that's the key, because every company understanding the baseline and setting the target based on the baseline is also really key. But like you, I'm also a little bit cautiously optimistic on all those targets because of the lack of the compliance regime within the framework. But is something good, good, and I assume that that this company will really stick to their targets. And many of the company has stick, especially some of the global company, they had really stick to their carbon emission target.
So I think you've kind of touched on Rakesh's question that is there a global standard way to monitor the meeting of this achieving net zero target? I think the answer is currently, unfortunately, there isn't. Now I'm going to come on, there's three questions which look at materials and, well, embodied carbon and in many ways. So to summarize those three questions, I think one of them looks at, actually, when you look at the materials and the supply chain into the built environment, actually a lot of these emissions aren't captured under the built environment, they're captured under the industrial sectors or other sectors. So there's a lot of indirect emissions which are hidden or swept under someone else's carpet. So there's a question on, you know, what's our view? What's your view on this? Do you think we should capture these, or, you know, should this be part of the whole life carbon methodology and supply chain management of the buildings? And another one looks at, well, actually, if we look at the decarbonization of energy production, then quite a lot of our, you know, embodied carbon as well would also be reduced. So I think if we could have a short discussion on those points of materials, that would be really good. And then I'll end on the exciting bit of value of biodiversity, if I may. So we'll tackle materials quickly in 5 minutes. I think we can do that, and then biodiversity. Thanks. Sandeep, I'll let you go first this time.
Thank you, Ben. Well, in terms of, for me, okay, one of the dilemma that what I see in the UNFCCC process is that any emission that is coming within your country territory belongs to the under the UNFCCC criteria, and it has its own limitation, and that's why some of the emission that is coming from the aviation sectors and also the emission coming from shipping sectors is not part of the let's say NDC. I'm just giving an example. Just to give example, in the case of Singapore has a Singapore Airlines and a big shipping hub, but the emission coming from these two particular sectors is not part of this Singapore NDC, and that's a dilemma. But we need to play with the game, and for me, maybe the extraction, the emission coming from the extraction material, not accounting industry and not building, is a, I would say, a big loophole. But but we really need to see how best we can really capture the ecological footprint within this entire calculation is a big challenge. I don't know how that can be done, but we have to stay with that limitation. But having said that, we really need to decarbonize and also be able to really work with other different conventions like the ICAO and IMO in terms of reducing the footprint from other sectors that is not part of the UNFCCC, I would say, traditional sectors. So and for example, there is also a different protocol where they are trying to reduce emission from refrigerator things and others. So we really need to look things from the holistic perspective, not from a individual or isolation perspective. And the ecological footprint could also play a bigger role, but I really don't know how that can be captured within the carbon, I would say, carbon debate. Okay. So let me stop this. That's my few points.
Sorry, Madhu, could you give us a one or two liner on your thoughts on that, please?
I was thinking of that. I think the loophole that Sandeep talks about is critical in terms of businesses. I think the only recommendation I would give to people who are looking at the material footprint is, one, you have to look at it. But since the targets are not mandatory, what I would recommend is that start having conversations with your suppliers. Look at their procurement systems. What questions are they asking? What kind of delays are they facing? I think how it comes across for most businesses that I've worked with is, it's not that, oh, they're losing it, or they're no longer fine, that there's climate change, but climate change comes to them in the face of there's a lot of delay in the shipments of materials, or the quality of materials in construction has declined quite significantly, and it's not quite meeting standards as it did before. And I think having these kinds of conversations, even though they're not directly related to decarbonization or embodied carbon, will become enablers to look at it and setting the stage for your business to be asking these questions in the longer term and being able to pitch that against your targets. But you have to do the work for it beforehand and build the relationships for it.
Great. So a final question actually came in, which is brilliant, which I unfortunately, would love to answer. I think we can, if you scroll down, we can look at that, and Shrin would be in a wonderful place to answer that, as Woha architects as well, as would many of our audience who may want to jump on this attendees' question about how do you actually do it in terms of delivering housing. Again, many architects, engineers in this room have the skill set to tell you how to do that brilliantly. So please feel free to answer that one. But I did want to touch on, because we are talking more about the policy level things here and strategy, I did want to talk about the economic values of biodiversity and natural capital, which was mentioned. So a shameless plug, Green Mark 2021, loved by industry, I'm sure, is being launched a pilot very soon. And there is a section called Resilience, and in that deals with quite a few natural climate solutions, including directing investments to it, the discussion on wild gardens and wild spaces within the building as well. So within that building boundary. So again, it's the sum of the parts making a greater whole, looking at all those kind of aspects. There is, I'm aware of a couple of studies on the economic values of biodiversity. One of them RICS published, where it looks at how do you actually do a valuation of it. And another one was, I think, many decades ago, where I think the entire GDP of the world could not cover the cost of the natural capital in it. But, we do tend to focus on the building and the infrastructure and the smart stuff. How can we start to really have that conversation to bring that value and articulate that both economic and intrinsic value of nature and of biodiversity within the built environment? Madhu, can I again start with you?
I think I will start with my example of sand alone. Sand is actually not just a commodity, it's land. And it's one of the impacts of the loss of sand is that entire waterways get shifted, and there's desertification happening in parts of the Mekong system. And at the same time, fishermen's livelihoods get lost. And there's a lot of debate around this, but the reality is that there are economic impacts to all of these at different points. So I think if we looked at it even just from a commodity level, the different commodities that we take have massive biodiversity impacts, and just looking at the economic value of that is significant. I think if you looked at it broadly, there's a lot of contention in how economic valuation is done. There are some studies that compare oil spill disasters and just how different valuation systems means that certain disasters get priced very low and others get priced very high. So the reality of it is that it is quite political in how valuation is done. But and often, like for instance, I think just for land reclamation in the Philippines, they costed the cost of coral damage to be at $600 billion. And the reality of it is that sometimes it's not taken seriously. So for some projects, valuation is a critical endeavor. because it helps people understand the scale of impact. But then in many others, it's not taken seriously. So I think some of it is understanding what language speaks in helping make a decision or making things become important or not. And I believe that it's an important mechanism, but it can't be the only one in for us to be able to understand the value of biodiversity. Some of that needs to be intrinsic and coming from a place of understanding our nostalgia towards nature and our growing up and knowing that and connecting with that. And I feel like we as humanity are quite disconnected, and that it's not just the valuation system, but also our social system of valuing nature.
Very good. So, Sandeep, any final comments before we close the session?
Well, not to add a lot, but what Madhu, just echoing what Madhu said, and I just remember one example when we talk about valuing the economic value of the biodiversity. I think in Singapore, while they were developing a Changi airport, there was an old tree, and that was cut down by the constructor in early 1970s. And there was a big debate in terms of how much the construction needs to pay or as a penalty. And later on, with all this debate for cutting that one tree, I think the construction company was asked to pay 70,000 Singapore dollar in 1970s. So my point is the value of the economic value of the biodiversity or even tree. We cannot really quantify it because, like what Madhu says before, it has other value as well. We really need to capitalize it. But as a conservation organization and as a nature people, I think we really need to lobby this issue much more widely and see how we can be able to address and be able to use that, I would say, approach in our approaches or in our thinking. And lastly, well, I'm not an architecture and other things, but any company, either the construction company or whatever company they are, definitely there are ways to decarbonize their portfolio. And the example that I showed before in terms of the CDL or the capital land, they had really understood what's their scope 1 and scope 2 emission and how that can be reduced either in the per square meter or within the scope 3 in terms of the life cycle, in terms of the supply chains, how they can be used more like a sustainable materials and other things, and how to reduce their let's say embodied carbon is also one of the things that we can be able to look into the urban built environment. So, but I will let other colleagues to join in. So that's all from my side, Ben. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Shrin, I've overrun. I'm very sorry. So over to you.
We are a little bit over time, so I have the very ungrateful task of putting an end to the session. But first and foremost, thank you all very, very much for your contributions. Madhu, Sandeep, and Ben, to you as well, of course, and to all our attendees in the webinar. I think there were some questions that maybe we did not entirely get to. Some of these questions are also more really architectural questions, whereas our panel today, as they highlighted, are not architectural practitioners, but are really from the adjacent disciplines that are also really, really relevant for us in this initiative. But I think we do take this as a hint that it's really, really great, and I think this is one of the most important aspects of the declaration, that we do have a interdisciplinary approach, that really we try to have as many disciplines join forces in this declaration. But maybe it's also good that we occasionally bring in some more practitioners, examples from our own field again, to talk about the practicalities of what can be done, as we have done in the past as well. I think some of the questions posed are actually almost starting to form a dialogue, so maybe we also look into other forms of exchange and communication going forward, because I think there's a really interesting what can we do, and then some other people directly coming with examples, like the recent Pritzker Prize being given to Lacaton Vassal. So I think that I can almost hear a discussion really there already developing in the Q&A chat. But we're 4 minutes over time, so I don't want to keep anyone any longer. Thanks to everyone for a wonderful 5th session, and we hope to see you all for the Declares and Shares episode number 6 in about 2 months' time. Thanks.